Good evening and welcome to Games Aperitif with Lyndon Richardson. In this series I'm explaining the merits of some of gaming's least understood genres to the drooling hordes of the internet. If Sonic can run faster than the speed of sound, then why does he drive a cart? And does anyone know what a roguelike actually is? Come with me once again as we quest across the barren plains of disenchantment, unearth the lost ruins of wonder, and thrust our rods of power deep into the betentacled abyss. In this episode we come to the isometric role-playing game, a genre first popularised by BioWare and Black Isle at the turn of the century, and more recently continued by Obsidian and several others. The original Baldur's Gate was released in 1998 and is a love letter to pen and paper Dungeons and Dragons. You create your character from an array of fantasy classes and races, such as rangers, dwarves, and barbarians. You quest through the world of the Forgotten Realms as brought to life in a series of gorgeously hand-painted areas, accompanied by a choice of unique and lovingly written companions. You are the Baalspawn, a child of the dead god of murder, and your quest is to escape those who wish to use your power for their own ends, and ultimately decide whether to contain or embrace its evil power. Combat is like a real-time strategy game, and the branching dialogue trees it introduced have since become a core role-playing system. The games include romances, difficult choices, and established BioWare's reputation as the best writers in the medium.
So I kicked him in the head till he was dead.
While far from the best game in the genre, the original Baldur's Gate perfectly captures the soul of the isometric role-playing game. It's the familiar comfort of a pulp fantasy novel. Only the protagonist is who you choose, the story is something you can influence, and you don't have to do your own voices. The previous year had already seen the release of the first Fallout, and in a few short years Fallout 2, Planescape Torment, and Baldur's Gate 2 would follow. The Fallout games began as a spiritual successor to an older game called Wasteland because they couldn't get the rights, much like Prince Harry began as a spiritual successor to Prince Charles because Diana had a ginger milkman. After Fallout 2, no other Fallout games were ever made, and the series remains unblemished by any flawed entries. Soon after came Planescape Torment, the Rocky Horror picture show of role-playing games, in that it's mad, beloved of first-year students, but still bloody brilliant. In Planescape Torment you play as the Nameless One, a man who cannot truly die, but loses his memories each time he is killed. The game begins as you awaken on a slab in a mortuary and make the acquaintance of a floating skull, who helps you out by reading the instructions that were tattooed on your back in a previous life. Bear with me. Over the course of the game you encounter a diverse cast of characters who have previously been saved or wronged by you, or even fallen in love with you in your previous lives. Every area in the world of Planescape is a thought experiment. If the inhabitants of a town go overboard on the murder and fornication, the town literally falls through the ground and into hell. In one bar you meet a man who is the human incarnation of the letter O, presumably the same person all those episodes of Sesame Street were dedicated to. But straddling this era just as the milkman straddled Princess Diana is Baldur's Gate 2. Improving on the original in almost every respect, Baldur's Gate 2 is one of the three key games in the history of Western role-playing games, and was the making of BioWare, in the same way that Diablo 2 defined Blizzard and Morrowind defined Bethesda. The game is one of the best balances of open-world exploration with a deeply personal narrative, as you seek to recover your soul from the wizard Irenicus, and then in the game's expansion, ultimately choose between becoming a god or giving up your power forever. But now comes the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this house of Blizzard. With the turn of the century, the phenomenal success of Diablo 2 triggered stock sound effects of cash registers, and publishers pressured developers to make their role-playing games into action role-playing games. This led to games like Dungeon Siege in 2002, and even the mighty BioWare used filler combat to pad out Neverwinter Nights. Neverwinter Nights is an incredibly important game, but also not a very good one, and you probably shouldn't play it. Firstly, it proved for all time that advanced 2D always looks better than primitive 3D. But most importantly, for BioWare it was never really about making a game. Instead, Neverwinter Nights remains the last and best attempt at recreating pen and paper role-playing games on computers. The toolset made it easier than any other game before or since for players to make their own role-playing games, their own MMOs, or act as dungeon master to other players. And while the game was a success, BioWare and the industry never followed its lead. It turned out there just wasn't very much money to be made in giving players the tools to entertain themselves, not compared to what Blizzard had made from Diablo 2, and after that in World of Warcraft subscriptions. In 2002, Morrowind was ported to the Xbox. and a huge new market for role-playing games on consoles was created. Pawing at their controllers with their sausage fingers, console gamers couldn't easily play anything like the mouse-based role-playing games of the past, and the genre was lost. A more elegant weapon from a more civilized age. Like a close-up shot of Megan Fox, the camera angle slowly drifted down, and from Neverwinter Nights through Knights of the Old Republic and finally Mass Effect and Dragon Age, the isometric role-playing game slowly became the third-person role-playing game. And while many of these games are undeniably classics, something had been lost. Instead of truly creating our own characters, we were given Shepard and just got to choose his or her gender. In pen and paper role-playing games, your success in combat was based on your character's skill, not the player's skill. But with console gamers demanding faster and more satisfying combat, this line was being blurred, and increasingly little separated role-playing games from third-person adventure games. And for some reason, instead of having lots of dialogue choices, there was always 3. And so the kingdom of role-playing games fell to ruin. The line of isometric games failed, BioWare withered, and rule was given over to lesser games. Even 2006's excellent Neverwinter Nights 2 sank without a trace without the console dollar. But like Princess Diana's Milkman, the isometric RPG came again. In 2012, Obsidian, with many of the surviving members of Black Isle, launched a Kickstarter for Pillars of Eternity, and this was followed by a great renaissance of the genre, including Divinity Original Sin, Tyranny, and Pillars of Eternity 2. Divinity Original Sin 2 and Pillars of Eternity 2 in particular are genuine classics and are probably the best games for new players. In its use of gameplay systems, Divinity Original Sin is in some ways closer to pen and paper role-playing games than any of its predecessors. One character might be able to read memories by eating body parts, or an item might allow you to change your appearance, and each of these systems completely changes the game. Pillars of Eternity 2, meanwhile, is a lushly made, story-driven, hand-painted open world. In what other game could you sail an entire ocean's worth of islands in your own pirate ship crewed by kobolds and ogres, regaling you with their very own sea shanties? In some ways, with their more modern technology and their streamlining of the game's more cumbersome elements, the new generation are better games than even the classics that inspired them. And they've finally worked out how to make them work for controllers. If you're playing these games while drinking, as always, pick your drinks to match the setting. In the dusty plains of Baldur's Gate 2, that might be a dry Spanish red, or a root beer in Fallout. One of the best things about these games is that they're really quite easy, so you can get pretty hammered. And so, like a snake scratching its own arse, the circle is complete. Even the makers of Divinity Original Sin are working on a new Baldur's Gate game. Now is the time to discover the isometric role-playing game, the most role-playing-y of all the role-playing games. Now come the days of the king. May they be blessed.
It was on a cold and stormy night. The snow was on the ground. A sailor boy stood on the quay. His ship was outward bound. His sweetheart standing by his side had many a silent tear. And as he pressed her to his heart, he whispered in her ear, "Farewell, farewell, my own true love, this parting gives me pain. I'll be your own true guiding light when I return again. My thoughts shall be of you, when the storm is riding high.